Ethan Carter had never liked routine survey missions, but they were part of the job. His ship, the Frontier, cruised low over the barren surface of Lorien 5, a planet marked as uninhabitable. Miles of jagged cliffs and endless gray sand stretched beneath him. He sighed, adjusting his scanner. It had been hours, and he'd found nothing of interest. Suddenly, his console beeped. A faint energy signature flickered on the screen. Too weak to be natural. Ethan frowned. "What's that?" he muttered. Adjusting the ship's course, he followed the signal to a canyon below. At the base of the canyon lay the wreckage of an alien shuttle, half buried in the sand. Its hull was scorched, and its engines looked like they had exploded mid-flight. Ethan felt a chill crawl up his spine. This wasn't a crash. It was sabotage. He landed the Frontier carefully nearby, donning his gear before stepping out. The air was thin and cold, biting at his skin through the suit. As he approached the wreck, he noticed the faint outline of a handprint on one of the broken panels. Someone had tried to crawl out. "Hello," Ethan called, his voice echoing in the canyon. Silence. He moved closer, his boots crunching on the sand. Peering into the wreck, he saw movement, a flicker of something pale. Inside, huddled against the cracked wall, was a woman. Her skin was a soft blue, her hair white and tangled. She was clutching a small child who hid behind her, wide-eyed and trembling. Ethan froze, his heart racing. They looked weak, their bodies frail and barely covered by torn clothing. "Hey, it's okay. I'm here to help," he said, raising his hand slowly. The woman flinched, pulling her daughter closer. Her eyes, a striking silver, locked onto his, full of fear and exhaustion. She tried to speak, but her voice was hoarse, and the words were foreign. Ethan knelt down, trying to appear less threatening. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said gently. He tapped the translator device on his wrist. "Do you understand me?" The woman hesitated before nodding slightly. "Help," she rasped, her voice weak. "My daughter." Ethan's chest tightened. The little girl peeked out from behind her mother, her tiny frame trembling. She couldn't have been more than 5 or 6 in human years. Her big silver eyes darted between Ethan and her mother. "You're hurt," Ethan said, scanning them with his handheld medical device. The readings were grim: dehydration, malnutrition, and low oxygen levels. They wouldn't survive much longer in this environment. He reached into his pack, pulling out a water flask and a ration bar. He offered them carefully. The woman eyed him suspiciously before taking the flask with shaking hands. She handed it to her daughter first, who drank eagerly. "What happened here?" Ethan asked softly, though he wasn't sure if she could explain. She glanced at the wreckage, her expression pained. "Left to die," she managed, her voice breaking. "No choice." Ethan clenched his jaw. Someone had abandoned them here, knowing they wouldn't survive. His mind raced. He couldn't leave them, not like this. "I'm getting you out of here," he said firmly. The woman's eyes widened, a mixture of hope and disbelief flickering across her face. Carefully, Ethan helped them out of the wreck. The little girl clung to him as her mother stumbled, too weak to walk steadily. He carried them both back to the Frontier, his mind already forming a plan. As he secured them in the medical bay, Ethan glanced at the woman and her daughter. They were scared, fragile, and utterly dependent on him now. Whoever had abandoned them would regret it. Ethan Carter wasn't just a traveler. He was about to become their protector. And he wouldn't fail. Inside the Frontier, Ethan worked quickly, activating the medical bay's automated systems. The woman lay on the examination table, her breaths shallow. Her daughter sat beside her, clutching her mother's hand tightly, her wide eyes scanning the unfamiliar surroundings. Ethan crouched to her level, trying to offer a comforting smile. "It's okay," he said softly. "You're safe now." The little girl didn't respond, but she didn't look away either. Progress, Ethan thought. The medical scanner beeped, displaying data he couldn't fully interpret. The woman's physiology was alien to him, but it was clear she was severely dehydrated and malnourished. Her oxygen levels were also critically low, likely due to the thin atmosphere of Lorien 5. Ethan grabbed a nutrient injector and hesitated. "This will help," he said, showing the device to the woman. Her silver eyes opened weakly, narrowing with suspicion. She didn't have the strength to resist, but her distrust was evident. "It's just nutrients," Ethan explained, tapping the translator on his wrist. "To make you stronger." Her gaze softened slightly. After a moment, she gave a faint nod. Ethan injected the nutrients, watching as her breathing steadied. Relief washed over him. The little girl tugged on his sleeve. Startled, Ethan looked down to see her pointing to the water flask he'd set aside. "Water?" she asked in a soft, trembling voice. Ethan's heart ached at how fragile she sounded. He handed her the flask, watching as she took careful sips before offering it to her mother. "Good kid," he murmured. Once the woman seemed stable, Ethan stepped back, giving her space. He needed answers, but they could wait. For now, survival was the priority. "Do you have a name?" he asked after a moment. He gestured to himself. "I'm Ethan. Ethan Carter." The woman's lips moved, but her voice was barely audible. "Leora," she whispered. Her gaze shifted to the little girl. "Kellera." Ethan smiled. "Leora and Kellera. Nice to meet you." Kellera didn't reply, but she didn't hide behind her mother this time. Small victories, Ethan thought. Leora's voice cracked as she spoke again. "Why? Help us." Ethan blinked, surprised by the question. "Why wouldn't I?" he said simply. "You needed help. I couldn't just leave you there." Leora looked away, her expression unreadable. Ethan wondered what kind of world she came from, where kindness was so unexpected. While Leora rested, Ethan turned his attention to their story. He needed to understand what had happened to them and why they were abandoned on such a harsh planet. He retrieved a portable scanner from his toolkit and returned to the wreckage of their shuttle. The damage confirmed his suspicions: deliberate sabotage. Critical systems had been destroyed, leaving the ship incapable of flight or even basic life support. Ethan's jaw tightened. Someone had wanted them dead. Back on the frontier, Ethan reviewed the data he'd collected. Among the fragments of the ship's logs, he found a few audio recordings in an unfamiliar language. He ran them through his translator, piecing together fragments of their story. "Exiled," one recording repeated. "Traitor, unworthy." Ethan frowned. Leora had been left here on purpose, her daughter abandoned with her. But why? What could warrant such cruelty? When Leora awoke, Ethan gently pressed for more information. "Leora," he began, keeping his tone soft, "I found some logs in your ship. They mentioned exile. Is that why you were here?" Her expression darkened, and she turned her face away. Kellera climbed into her lap, resting her head on her mother's chest. "No choice," Leora said at last. "Betrayed." Bide was a threat. To who? Ethan asked, his curiosity sharpening. "Your people." Leora hesitated, her voice trembling. "Yes. My ideas. Dangerous to them." Ethan's mind raced. She must have been important. Perhaps a leader or a scientist. Someone whose ideas challenged the status quo. Whatever the case, she had been discarded, along with her innocent child. "You're not alone anymore," Ethan said firmly. "I'll get you both somewhere safe." Leora studied him for a long moment, her silver eyes searching his face. Finally, she nodded, though her expression remained guarded. For now, she had no choice but to trust this human. Ethan leaned back in the pilot's chair, staring at the cracked screen of his ship's terminal. The atmosphere outside the frontier was hostile, the winds howling against the hull like angry spirits. He glanced over his shoulder at the medical bay, where Leora and Kellera rested. His resolve hardened. They couldn't stay here, not another day. Leora had improved slightly after the nutrient injections, but she was still weak. Kellera, though less frail than her mother, stayed close to her side, her wide silver eyes darting around cautiously. They were both scared, and Ethan couldn't blame them. This wasn't just survival, it was escape. The biggest challenge was the state of his ship. The Frontier was designed for solo missions, not carrying extra passengers, and its systems were old and prone to malfunctions. Still, it was their only hope. He had to make it work. "Leora," Ethan said, walking into the medical bay. She looked up at him, her pale blue skin still dull from exhaustion. "We're leaving this planet. I'm taking you and Kelleria somewhere safe." Her eyes widened slightly, but her expression quickly turned skeptical. "Is it possible?" she asked, her voice hoarse but steady. "It has to be," Ethan replied. "I've done a full check on my ship. It's not perfect, but it'll get us off this rock. I just need a little time to prep." Kelleria, sitting on her mother's lap, tilted her head. "Safe?" she asked softly, her small voice filled with hope. Ethan crouched down to her level and smiled. "Safe, I promise." Leora studied him carefully. Trust didn't come easily to her, especially not after what she had been through. But there was something in Ethan's voice that made her believe him. Perhaps it was the way he spoke to Kelleria, as if her safety mattered more than anything. As Ethan returned to the cockpit, he checked the ship's sensors. The planet's unstable weather patterns weren't making things easier. Acid storms loomed on the horizon, and the atmospheric turbulence could tear the Frontier apart during takeoff if he wasn't careful. He grabbed his toolkit and headed outside to make the final adjustments to the engines. The moment he stepped into the canyon, the harsh winds stung his exposed skin, and the air smelled faintly of sulfur. He worked quickly, tightening bolts, patching leaks, and recalibrating the thrusters. Every minute counted. But as he worked, something made him stop. A low, guttural growl echoed through the canyon. Ethan froze, his hand hovering over the engine panel. Slowly, he turned his head. A creature emerged from the shadows, a massive reptilian predator with jagged scales and glowing amber eyes. Its long claws scratched the rocky ground as it advanced, its gaze fixed on Ethan. "Well, great," Ethan muttered under his breath. He reached for his sidearm, a compact energy pistol that he rarely had to use. The creature snarled, its muscles tensing as it prepared to pounce. Before it could leap, Ethan fired a warning shot into the ground near its feet. The blast sent up a plume of dust, causing the creature to hesitate. "Back off," Ethan growled, keeping his aim steady. The creature roared in defiance, but the sound of approaching footsteps made it pause. Leora appeared at the entrance of the ship, clutching a metallic rod she'd found in the wreckage. She didn't look strong, but her presence was enough to unnerve the predator. It snarled again before retreating into the shadows. Ethan exhaled sharply, lowering his weapon. "You shouldn't be out here," he said, walking toward her. "It's too dangerous." "I heard the noise," Leora said, her voice firm despite her weariness. "I couldn't let you face it alone." Ethan stared at her for a moment, impressed by her courage. "Thanks," he said simply. "But let me handle things like this. You focus on getting better." Back inside, Ethan worked late into the night, double-checking every system. Leora and Kelleria watched from a distance, their presence a quiet reminder of why he couldn't fail. As the ship's engines roared to life, Ethan felt a surge of determination. They were getting off this planet. No matter what, the engines of the Frontier hummed softly, a promising sign that their escape might finally be within reach. Ethan wiped sweat from his brow, leaning against the bulkhead as he surveyed his work. The ship was patched, calibrated, and as ready as it could ever be for takeoff. He glanced at the time. A storm was approaching fast, and they had a narrow window to leave. "Ethan," Leora's voice called from behind him. He turned to see her standing in the dim light of the corridor, her posture still weak, but her expression determined. Kelleria peeked out from behind her, clutching her mother's hand. "How are you holding up?" Ethan asked, his voice gentle. He was still getting used to how fragile she seemed, yet her spirit was unbroken. "We are better," she said slowly, choosing her words carefully. Thanks to you. Ethan nodded, offering a small smile. Good. We're almost ready to leave, but we'll need to move fast once the storm clears. It's going to be rough. Leora hesitated before stepping closer. You're risking much for us. Why? Ethan's expression softened. Because I can't stand by and do nothing when people are in trouble. You've been through enough. It's time you got a chance to fight back. Leora's eyes glistened with something he hadn't seen before. Hope. Thank you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Their conversation was cut short by a loud metallic clanging sound echoing from outside the ship. Ethan's muscles tensed, and his hand instinctively moved to his sidearm. Stay here, he said, his tone firm. Leora pulled Calora closer, retreating to the safety of the medical bay. Ethan grabbed a flashlight and carefully stepped down the ramp, scanning the canyon. The storm's edge was already visible on the horizon, dark clouds churning violently. But the sound hadn't come from the weather. It was something else. As he moved further from the ship, the flashlight's beam caught movement. A dark shape slithered between the jagged rocks, its silhouette low and sleek. His heart pounded as he realized what it was. A predator, larger than the one he'd faced earlier. Its amber eyes gleamed in the dim light, locked on him. Well, that's just fantastic, Ethan muttered under his breath. The creature let out a guttural hiss, its long tail flicking in anticipation. It was hunting him. Ethan slowly backed toward the ship, keeping his weapon raised. The creature crept closer, its sharp claws scraping the rocky ground. He had faced dangerous animals before, but this one was faster and more calculated. A wrong move could mean death, not just for him, but for Leora and Calora as well. When the creature lunged, Ethan fired. The energy blast grazed its shoulder, causing it to roar in pain, but it didn't stop. It swiped at him with razor-sharp claws, forcing him to dive to the side. Rolling to his feet, he aimed again, this time hitting it square in the chest. The creature staggered, snarling angrily, but refusing to retreat. Suddenly, a loud metallic clang echoed from the ship. The creature turned toward the sound, distracted. Ethan's stomach dropped as he realized what had happened. Calora had stepped onto the ramp, her small figure frozen in fear as she stared at the predator. No, Ethan shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. He sprinted toward her, firing another shot to draw the creature's attention. The blast struck its side, and it roared again, but this time it hesitated, clearly wounded. Calora, get inside, Ethan yelled, his heart racing. Leora appeared at the top of the ramp, her expression panicked as she pulled her daughter back into the ship. Ethan seized the opportunity, taking one final shot. The blast hit the predator's head, and it collapsed with a thud, its massive body motionless. Ethan stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, his weapon still raised. When he returned to the ship, Leora and Calora were waiting for him. Calora ran to him, her small arms wrapping around his leg. You saved me, she whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan crouched down, placing a hand on her shoulder. Always, he said softly. Then, looking at Leora, he added, we can't wait any longer. We're leaving now. Leora nodded, her trust in him now absolute. As the storm loomed closer, Ethan powered up the engines, his mind focused on one thing, getting them to safety. They were running out of time, but he wouldn't let them down. Not now, not ever. The Frontier rumbled as its engines roared to life, shaking the floor beneath Ethan's boots. He adjusted the controls, his hands moving quickly across the console. The storm was almost upon them, and the winds outside howled like a furious beast. Time was running out. Everyone strapped in. Ethan called over his shoulder. Yes, Leora replied, her voice steady despite the tension. She sat in the co-pilot's seat, Calora secured tightly in a harness beside her. The little girl gripped the armrests, her silver eyes wide with both fear and excitement. Ethan glanced back at them, giving a reassuring nod. Hold on tight. This might get bumpy. The ship's thrusters fired, lifting the Frontier off the ground. Sand and debris swirled around them, slamming against the hull as Ethan guided the ship upward. The storm's edge was closer than he had anticipated, and the turbulence made the controls feel like they were fighting him. The ship lurched violently, and Calora let out a small yelp. Lyora instinctively reached for her daughter's hand, whispering something calming in her native tongue. Ethan gritted his teeth, focusing on keeping the ship steady. "Come on, old girl, don't give up on me now," he muttered to the Frontier, coaxing the aging vessel to hold together. The storm hit them full force just as they cleared the canyon. Ethan's view screen was filled with swirling clouds of sand and lightning. The ship shook under the pressure, alarms blaring as warning lights lit up the cockpit. "We're taking too much strain," Lyora shouted, gripping the edges of her seat. "I know," Ethan shouted back, his voice tense but controlled. He adjusted the power to the stabilizers, trying to counter the turbulence. The ship groaned in protest, but it held. Barely. Calora whimpered, her small hands clutching her harness straps. Ethan's heart ached at the sound, but he couldn't afford to look back. His focus had to stay on the controls. "We'll make it," he said, more to himself than anyone else. "We have to." As the storm intensified, a new problem arose. The ship's sensors detected sharp, jagged debris being hurled through the atmosphere. If any of it struck the hull, it could spell disaster. Ethan adjusted their trajectory, weaving through the worst of the storm. His hands moved with precision, years of experience guiding him. Lyora watched him closely, her admiration for his skill growing despite the chaos. "You're good at this," she said, her voice steady but laced with urgency. "Let's hope that's enough," Ethan replied, his eyes never leaving the screen. A sudden jolt rocked the ship as a piece of debris clipped one of the stabilizers. The Frontier spun slightly, alarms blaring louder. Ethan cursed under his breath, wrestling with the controls to regain balance. "We're hit," Lyora exclaimed, her grip tightening on the console. "I see it," Ethan shot back. He diverted power to the remaining stabilizers, pushing the ship harder than it was meant to handle. The hull creaked, but the spin slowed, and the ship leveled out. Calora's small voice broke the tension. "Are we going to fall?" Ethan glanced at her through the rearview monitor, forcing a smile. "Not today, kiddo." He pushed the ship forward, breaking through the densest part of the storm. The clouds began to thin, revealing the dark expanse of space beyond. Relief washed over him as the turbulence lessened and the Frontier stabilized. "We're out," Ethan announced, exhaling a shaky breath. He looked at Lyora, who nodded, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and gratitude. Calora unbuckled her harness and crawled into her mother's lap, burying her face against Lyora's chest. "We're safe?" she asked softly. "Yes, Calora," Lyora whispered, stroking her daughter's hair. "We're safe." Ethan leaned back in his seat, his hands trembling slightly from the adrenaline. He glanced at the navigational map, plotting a course toward the nearest human outpost. "We're not out of the woods yet," he said, his voice quieter now. "But we're alive. That's what matters." Lyora turned to him, her silver eyes soft but serious. "Alive, thanks to you." Ethan shrugged, though her words warmed him. "That's what we do, Lyora. We look out for each other." As the Frontier cruised through the safety of space, Ethan allowed himself a small moment of peace. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. The silence of space was a stark contrast to the chaos they had just escaped. The hum of the Frontier's engines provided a calming rhythm as Ethan guided the ship through the dark void. He had set a course for the nearest human outpost, but his mind was far from at ease. Lyora sat in the co-pilot's seat, her hands resting in her lap. She was quiet, her gaze fixed on the stars outside the window. Calora had fallen asleep in the medical bay, wrapped in a blanket that was far too big for her tiny frame. "Are you holding up okay?" Ethan asked, glancing at Lyora. She turned her head slightly, her silver eyes meeting his. "I am grateful," she said softly. "You risked much for us." Ethan shrugged, his focus returning to the controls. "Couldn't just leave you there." Leora studied him for a moment, as if trying to decipher what kind of person he was. "You are different," she said finally. "Humans are not known for such kindness among my people." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "And what are humans known for?" Her expression darkened. "Violence, greed, destruction." Ethan chuckled dryly. "Not entirely wrong, but we're more than that. Guess you've just met the wrong humans." "Perhaps," Leora admitted, though her tone remained cautious. Silence settled between them again, but Ethan could sense the tension. There was more to Leora's story, something she hadn't shared yet. He decided to give her space, knowing trust would take time. As the hours passed, Ethan ran a diagnostic on the ship. The damage from their escape was significant, but repairable. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just beyond their sensors. The feeling proved right when a proximity alarm blared, jolting both Ethan and Leora. He quickly scanned the screen and cursed under his breath. "What is it?" Leora asked, her voice tense. "We've got company," Ethan replied, pointing to the radar. A ship was closing in on them fast, its design unfamiliar but menacing. Leora's face paled. "They found us." "Who?" Ethan demanded, his tone sharp. "My people," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They won't let us escape." Ethan's jaw tightened. He activated the ship's defensive systems, though he knew the Frontier was no match for a fully armed vessel. "Why are they after you?" he asked, his eyes never leaving the radar. Leora hesitated, her hands trembling. "I was a diplomat," she said finally. "I worked to unite factions, to bring peace, but my ideas were unpopular. Powerful leaders saw me as a threat to their control. So they exiled you?" Ethan asked, his voice laced with anger. "They didn't just exile me," Leora said bitterly. "They'd wanted me dead. Leaving us on that planet was meant to ensure no one could find us." Ethan's grip on the controls tightened. "Well, they failed. And now, they'll regret it." The pursuing ship fired a warning shot, the blast rocking the Frontier. Ethan's fingers flew across the console as he activated evasive maneuvers. The Frontier wasn't built for combat, but Ethan's experience as a pilot gave him an edge. "Hold on," he warned, diving the ship sharply to avoid another blast. The pursuing vessel was faster, but Ethan relied on the Frontier's agility, weaving through the debris of an old asteroid field. Lyra clung to her seat, her silver eyes wide with fear. "You can't fight them." "I'm not planning to," Ethan said through gritted teeth, "but I can outsmart them." Using the asteroid field to his advantage, Ethan led the enemy ship into a narrow passage. He carefully navigated through the tight space, his hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. The enemy pilot wasn't as skilled. A miscalculation sent their ship careening into a large asteroid, the impact shattering their hull. Ethan exhaled sharply as the radar showed the enemy ship breaking apart. "That'll teach them," he muttered. Leora stared at him, her expression a mixture of awe and disbelief. "You saved us again." Ethan leaned back in his seat, his hand shaking slightly from the intensity of the chase. "I told you," he said, his voice steady but firm. "I'm not letting anyone hurt you or Kara." Lyra's gaze softened, and for the first time, a small smile touched her lips. "You are not what I expected, Ethan Carter." He glanced at her, smirking. "I'll take that as a compliment." As the Frontier resumed its course, Ethan couldn't help but feel a growing sense of responsibility. Lyra and Calora had been abandoned, betrayed, and hunted. But as long as they were with him, he'd make sure they were safe, no matter what it took. The Frontier cruised through open space, its engines humming steadily. Ethan sat in the pilot's chair, his eyes darting between the navigation screen and the radar. After their narrow escape from the pursuing ship, the silence felt heavy, like the calm before a storm. In the co-pilot's seat, Leora sat quietly, her posture tense. She hadn't spoken much since the chase, but her expression betrayed the weight of her thoughts. Kellera was in the medical bay, drawing shapes on a datapad Ethan had given her to keep her occupied. Ethan finally broke the silence. "They really don't want you alive, do they?" Leora's silver eyes flicked toward him, the corners of her mouth tightening. "No, my survival threatens everything they stand for." "Because you wanted peace?" Ethan asked, his tone skeptical. "Doesn't sound like a good reason to kill someone." Leora sighed, her voice carrying a bitter edge. "Peace was only part of it. I discovered their corruption, how they exploited our people to maintain their power. My efforts to expose them made me a target. Exile was their way of silencing me." Ethan leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping against the console. "Well, they've got another problem now. You're alive, and you've got me." Leora studied him for a moment, her gaze softening. "You are different, not like the humans I was taught to fear." "Maybe you've just been listening to the wrong people," Ethan replied with a smirk. "We're not all bad, you know." Before Leora could respond, the ship's radar beeped, a soft but urgent sound that made Ethan's stomach drop. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing at the screen. A small blip had appeared, following them at a distance. "We've got a tail," Ethan muttered, his hands moving to the controls. Leora stiffened. "Another ship." "Looks like it," Ethan said grimly. "They're keeping their distance, but they're definitely tracking us." Fear flashed in Leora's eyes. "They won't stop. They'll keep sending more until we're dead." Ethan tightened his grip on the controls, his jaw clenching. "Not if I have anything to say about it." He adjusted their course, heading toward a nearby nebula. The thick gas clouds would provide cover, making it harder for their pursuers to follow. As the Frontier entered the nebula, the stars outside the window blurred into a hazy glow. "Hold on," Ethan warned, his voice tense. "This might get rough." The ship rattled slightly as they plunged deeper into the nebula. Ethan kept a close eye on the radar, watching the blip flicker as the interference from the nebula's magnetic fields disrupted the enemy sensors. "Can they still see us?" Leora asked, her voice tight. "Not clearly," Ethan replied. "But we can't stay here forever. This place messes with our systems too." Kellera appeared at the cockpit entrance, clutching her datapad. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice small. Ethan turned to her, forcing a reassuring smile. "Just a little detour, kiddo. Nothing to worry about." Kellera didn't look convinced, but she nodded, trusting him. She climbed into Leora's lap, seeking comfort. Leora wrapped her arms around her daughter, her protective instincts clear. Ethan's focus snapped back to the radar as the blip disappeared entirely. For a moment, relief washed over him, until the ship's proximity alarm blared again. "They're here," Ethan shouted, his hands flying over the controls. The enemy ship had emerged from the other side of the nebula, closing in fast. Leora's grip on Kellera tightened. "What can we do?" "Outsmart them," Ethan said through gritted teeth. He pushed the Frontier into a steep dive, weaving through the dense gas clouds. The enemy ship followed, its weapons firing bursts of energy that barely missed their hull. Ethan's mind raced. The Frontier wasn't built for combat, but he had one advantage: the nebula. He activated the ship's decoy systems, releasing a cluster of small drones designed to mimic their signal. The enemy ship hesitated, its sensors confused by the multiple targets. "Come on, take the bait," Ethan muttered. The enemy ship fired at the decoys, and Ethan seized the opportunity to change course, slipping away unnoticed. As they emerged from the nebula, the radar showed no sign of pursuit. "We lost them," Ethan said, exhaling deeply. Leora looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude and awe. "You saved us. Again." Ethan smirked, his confidence returning. "That's what I do." But as he set a course back to the human outpost, a nagging thought lingered in his mind. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. And if they were going to survive, they'd need more than just luck. They'd need a plan. The Frontier glided smoothly through space, its engines purring quietly. Ethan glanced over at the navigation panel, tracking their progress toward the human outpost. It had been a long and tense journey, but they were almost there. The stars ahead seemed to promise safety, a haven far from the dangers that had pursued them so relentlessly. Leora sat quietly in the co-pilot's seat, her expression distant as she stared at the starry expanse outside the window. Kelra was playing with a small toy in the back, her laughter echoing softly through the ship. It was a welcome sound, one that reminded Ethan how much was at stake. "How are you holding up?" Ethan asked, his voice gentle. He'd noticed how quiet Leora had become since their last escape. She'd been lost in thought, perhaps still processing the horrors of her past. Leora didn't answer right away. She was still adjusting to this strange, new life with him, her rescuer, her unexpected ally. Finally, she turned to him, her silver eyes reflecting a mixture of gratitude and sadness. "Better," she said quietly, "but there are things I haven't told you. Things I should have said earlier." Ethan raised an eyebrow, but before he could respond, Leora continued, "My people, they're not just after me because of my political views. There's something more. Something dangerous." Ethan's stomach tightened. "What are you talking about?" Leora hesitated, glancing over at Kelra, who was still absorbed in her toy. "I was part of a research project," she began, her voice steady, but carrying a deep weight. "A project that could change the future of my people. It was meant to help us evolve, to make us stronger. But it went wrong." Ethan frowned. "What went wrong?" "The project was experimental. They were trying to create something new, something more powerful than what we already are," Leora continued. "But when I discovered the truth, I exposed it. The project was too dangerous. It could have torn our entire society apart." Ethan listened carefully, trying to understand. "So you became a target because you tried to stop them?" Leora nodded. "Exactly. They branded me a traitor, someone who was too weak to understand the importance of their plans. They thought I would bring everything down with my weakness, and they couldn't risk that." Ethan processed her words in silence, his mind racing. He had known there was more to Leora's story, but this was bigger than he'd imagined. She wasn't just a political exile. She was a survivor of something much darker. "You're not weak, Leora," Ethan said firmly, his voice soft but sincere. "What you did took a lot of strength. You stood up for what was right, even when it cost you everything." Leora looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "You don't understand. I thought I could change things, but in the end, I was powerless against them. I couldn't stop what they were doing." Ethan shook his head. "No one's ever truly powerless. You fought when most people would have turned away. You've already done more than most people ever will." Leora's lips trembled as she took in his words. For the first time since they met, she looked at him not with distrust, but with a kind of quiet appreciation. Her voice was almost a whisper when she spoke again. "And now I'm depending on you. You've kept me and Kelra alive when we had no hope left. I don't know how to thank you for that." Ethan met her gaze, his expression softening. "You don't have to thank me. You and Kelra deserve to be safe. And that's what I'm going to make sure happens." They sat in silence for a moment, the hum of the Frontier filling the quiet. Then Ethan's voice broke through. "We're almost there," he said, pointing to the radar. "The outpost is just ahead." Leora nodded, her fingers tightening on the armrest. Are they going to help us?" Ethan's eyes met hers. "They'll help. I've already contacted them. They know what's going on, and they've got the resources to protect us." A long, deep breath escaped Leora, as if a weight she hadn't known she was carrying had lifted, even if just a little. "Thank you," she said again, her voice filled with raw emotion. Ethan smiled. "You're welcome." As the Frontier approached the outpost, Leora and Kelra both looked out the window. The station loomed ahead, its lights shining brightly against the dark canvas of space. It felt like a safe harbor, a place where they could finally rest. The journey had been long, filled with danger, betrayal, and fear. But now, with the outpost in sight, it seemed like the beginning of something new. A future, perhaps, where Lyora and Calora could live without looking over their shoulders. A future that, against all odds, Ethan had helped create. The frontier glided toward the human outpost, its engines humming steadily as the stars streaked past them. Ethan felt the tension in his shoulders ease. After everything they had been through, the sight of the outpost was a welcome relief. It wasn't the grandest of places, just a small station that provided supplies and refuge to travelers. But to Lyora and Calora, it meant safety. Almost there, Ethan said, his voice calm as he adjusted the controls. Lyora sat in the co-pilot's seat, her eyes fixed on the distant outpost. She had grown quieter since they had entered the system. Calora was once again in the back, playing with her toy, her small voice occasionally breaking through the quiet hum of the ship. But even with her playful distractions, there was an air of uncertainty that hung around Lyora. "Are you okay?" Ethan asked, glancing at her from the corner of his eye. Lyora didn't answer immediately. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap, and her eyes seemed distant, lost in thought. Finally, she turned to him, her silver eyes meeting his with a mix of gratitude and hesitation. "I never imagined I would find a place like this," Lyora said softly. "A place where I could breathe, where Calora could be safe." Ethan nodded, trying to keep his focus on the path ahead. "You've earned it. You fought for her, for yourself. Now it's time to rest." The outpost station grew larger on the horizon, its metal surface gleaming under the distant light of a nearby star. Ethan set the ship on its approach, his hand steady as the frontier descended toward the landing pad. As they touched down, Ethan looked over at Lyora, who was still quiet. He understood. After everything they had been through, this place felt like a strange, almost surreal relief. They were safe, but that safety came with a price, and Lyora had paid it in ways that went deeper than anyone could see. "We're here," he said softly, his voice breaking the silence. "You made it." Lyora's lips trembled for a moment, her eyes blinking rapidly as though fighting back tears. Then, to his surprise, she smiled, small but genuine. "Thank you, Ethan," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Ethan smiled back, his heart warming. "You don't need to thank me. You're here because of your own strength." She nodded slowly, her gaze drifting to Calora, who was still distracted by her toy. The little girl's giggle filled the cockpit, and for the first time in a long while, Lyora seemed to relax. They disembarked from the frontier, stepping onto the landing platform of the outpost. A small group of human officers approached them, their faces a mix of curiosity and professionalism. Ethan gave them a nod of acknowledgement as he led Lyora and Calora toward them. The officer in charge, a woman with short dark hair and a stern expression, extended her hand. "Ethan Carter," she said, "we've been expecting you, and you must be Lyora and Calora." Lyora took a hesitant step forward, but Calora clung to her side, hiding behind her mother's legs. The officer smiled warmly at the little girl before turning back to Lyora. "We've heard your story. You're safe here. We'll make sure no one comes after you." Lyora looked at the officer, then at Ethan. For the first time in what felt like ages, she looked at peace, as though the heavy weight of fear had finally been lifted from her shoulders. "Thank you," she said again, her voice steady now. The officer nodded. "We'll get you settled. We got food, supplies, and medical support ready. It's not much, but it's safe." Lyora turned to Ethan, her silver eyes full of gratitude. "You've given me a new chance. For me, and for Calora." Ethan smiled, feeling a quiet satisfaction in the knowledge that he had helped them start a new life. "You'll make the most of it. I know you will." As Lyora and Calora were escorted to the station, Ethan watched them go, feeling a sense of completion. He had risked everything to bring them here, and now they had a chance to heal, to rebuild. He had done his part, and that was enough. But as he turned back to the frontier, he couldn't help but wonder if there were others like Ladora and Calora, others who needed a chance, who had nowhere else to turn. Maybe his journey wasn't over yet. Maybe there were more lives to change, more people to help. With that thought in mind, Ethan Carter took one last look at the stars above. The road ahead was uncertain, but he knew one thing for sure. He would keep moving forward. And wherever he went, he would keep making a difference.